Hello, Health 230 students. This is Brian Clark. Today we will be going over chapter number 14, Life Cycle Nutrition, Pregnancy and Lactation. In my opinion, this is one of the single most important chapters in this text, and considering the age of many of you all who are taking this class, it may very well be personally relevant to you, either in the immediate or not too distant future. But regardless of your age and the personal relevance of this chapter, as a clinician, the information in this chapter is something that you will need to know, because you certainly in the clinical field will be dealing with women who are pregnant and or lactating, and you need to be able to make appropriate recommendations. So I want to ask that you pay pay special attention to the material in this chapter. I oftentimes like to make an analogy about a construction site and the body. And daily we have millions upon millions, and maybe even billions upon billions of cells being formed. And for those cells to be formed, appropriate building materials must be present. In our case, those are vitamins and minerals and amino acids and essential fatty acids. On a construction site, you need things like cinder blocks and mortar and brick and lumber and screws and nails and drywall and carpet and windows and all of the multitude of building materials that are needed to build a house appropriately, or build any type of building appropriately. And without those key components, I think we all can see how a house would not be built properly if certain building blocks were left out. Think about trying to build the home that you're living in now, or the apartment that you're living in now, without any lumber. Or maybe you had plenty of lumber but not enough nails, or maybe you had plenty of lumber and nails but you didn't have any windows. Well, by leaving out just a single component, very quickly it makes the house or apartment that you're in non-functional. And the same is true with our bodies. They need very specific amounts of nutrients, in particular vitamins, minerals, amino acids, fatty acids, for those cells to be built. And that is especially critical during the pregnancy and lactation phase, because a fetus and an infant are going through massive amounts of cellular division, or I guess maybe a better way to say that is a massive amount of cellular division is happening in the fetus and the infant during that time frame. And without appropriate building blocks, integral functions do not occur, because on the cellular level those cells are not being built correctly, and what that results in is tissue not being built correctly. We're going to talk a lot about these items here, avoiding alcohol, illicit drugs, and teratogens, but we'll talk about that later in the chapter. It's important to note that a new life begins at conception. Very quickly after conception, we have rapid cellular division, and it's amazing how quickly we see growth and development of that zygote, and then embryo, and then ultimately fetus. And they do proceed on their own schedule. And it's not like a construction site where they can put everything on hold for a day if the lumber truck does not show up, or the hardware store runs out of screws. The process is going to continue. Unfortunately, if some of those key building blocks are not available, what happens is the pregnancy terminates. We're going to talk about critical periods. We're going to talk a lot about folate. Folate is absolutely imperative to appropriate fetal development. We'll talk about why here in just a minute. I do want to touch on figure 14-1, because it is of significant importance. It's very important for you to understand that the placenta is such that there is not sharing of a blood supply between the fetus and the mother. And if you look at figure 14-1. I think I can maybe point at it fairly well here. You see here, this is the umbilical cord, and we have arteries and veins here. And at no time do these arteries and veins connect to the maternal blood source. So the placenta is an organ that allows for there to be transfer of oxygen and nutrients without transfer of blood from the mother to the fetus. Critical periods. This is something that you absolutely must understand. And I'm going to skip forward here just a little bit. And you can see here on this timeline when these critical periods are occurring. The central nervous system critical period very early on, between 2 and about 5 weeks, the central nervous system is being formed. The heart critical period about 2.5 weeks to that's about 5.5, maybe 6 weeks. And if nutrients are not available during those critical periods, then any one of these systems or anatomical parts can be significantly affected. And what we see is that in normal development, we have a nice linear relationship between time and growth. However, sometimes there will be a decrement in nutrition, or a situation where a mother is not getting an adequate amount of a nutrient, and there may be an adverse influence. After the critical period, and right here this dotted line is illustrating the critical period, after that critical period, we can have an adverse influence and the fetus can still recover. However, if that adverse event occurs, or adverse influence occurs prior to the end of the critical period, impairment is going to last for a lifetime. There is no recovery from that. One of the single most prominent ones that we see are neural tube defects. And neural tube defects oftentimes occur because, oops, I went the wrong way. Neural tube defects oftentimes occur because of inadequate folate consumption during that time frame between 2 and about 5.5 to 6 weeks, when the central nervous system is forming. And folate is needed for DNA replication, or DNA synthesis. And of course, every time that a cell goes through mitosis, and that's just a fancy word for cell division, there has to be DNA replication. And remember, DNA is your blueprint. Every cell has a full copy of your blueprint, everything that makes you you. And the DNA sequence is very long and needs a very significant amount of folate, as well as B12. But we'll continue on the folate line right now. Without that adequate amount of folate, then the DNA replication or DNA synthesis does not occur properly, and in that type of situation, the central nervous system does not form properly, ultimately leading to some major effects later in the pregnancy and after birth. And oftentimes, you're going to end up with a stillbirth due to the fact that the central nervous system doesn't form properly. You can see here at 4 weeks, the neural tube is still open. It is yet to close. Here at 6 weeks, it has fully closed. Sometimes the neural tube will actually stay open if there's not an adequate amount of folate, and as you can well imagine, that results in some pretty major birth defects. And you can go out to an internet browser such as Google and search for images of things, search for images on neural tube defects, and you'll see some pretty graphic birth defects. In particular, spina bifida is the one that we see commonly. Moving on with growth and development during pregnancy. Some things or factors that will increase the occurrence of neural tube defects: maternal diabetes, which is very related to dietary intake as well as the amount of physical activity that a mother is getting, the maternal use of anti-seizure medications, and maternal obesity. We've already talked about that already, but I will mention that the RDA during pregnancy is 600 micrograms a day. Luckily, folate is in many fortified grains. That's a really good argument for eating fortified breads, not white bread. We also know that critical periods relate to chronic diseases, that if a mother is malnourished during those during those critical periods, that adverse effects can stay with the fetus for a lifetime. It increases risk for things like heart disease and stroke and high blood pressure and diabetes. Let's move on to maternal weight gain, because there are a lot of misconceptions about how much weight is appropriate for a woman to gain. And it certainly is important for her to gain an appropriate amount of weight. However, we do not want women gaining inappropriate or inordinate amounts of weight, as is oftentimes the case. I'll mention this now because it's on the slide, that low birth weight babies are ones that weigh less than 5 pounds 8 ounces or 5 1/2 pounds. Women who are underweight prior to conception tend to have lower birth weight babies. There's going to be higher rates of preterm deliveries and, of course, preterm deaths. Here's what we more commonly see. The one that I just talked about, women being overweight, those are far and few between. We in our society seldom see women being underweight unless there's some type of underlying issue, and oftentimes those underlying issues are drug use. But more common in our society is a person being overweight or obese. And children that are born to overweight or obese mothers tend to be born post-term or greater than 42 weeks. They have a tendency to be rather heavy, oftentimes greater than 9 pounds. And that's a big baby, and oftentimes giving birth to a 9-pound or larger baby can be rather problematic. There's going to be higher risks for neural tube defects and heart defects and other abnormalities. I'm going to just skip down to actually, I'm just going to make a general recommendation. You can see the recommendations for women who are underweight or healthy weight or overweight or what have you. A good rule of thumb is about 25 to 30 pounds that a woman should gain during pregnancy, unless she's already overweight, in which case the increased fat stores are not needed, and somewhere between 15 to 20 to 25 pounds would be appropriate for a woman who is overweight when she gets pregnant. And although your text does say this, and actually let's see if a graph, you're going to see this information in your text. And I do want to point out that although I almost never disagree with this text because it is a wonderful resource, that I have seen material that's contradictory to what you see there in figure 14-7. Certainly that 3 1/2 pounds during the first trimester, very standard material, but I have seen information that says that this graph really looks more like this, that you see more of a curve here as opposed to after that 3 1/2 weeks that it goes to a linear relationship. I'm going to stop here, and you can pick up with lecture 2 of 3.